Let's go live to the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, now fresh from the State Labor Conference at the weekend. You managed to keep the team together pretty much. Are you happy with how it all went?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Laura. Look, we were. It's the first Labor conference in over a decade where we were able to come to the conference as a government rather than in opposition, and it was no victory lap. It was really about me and the team laying out the challenges ahead for New South Wales and making sure that we get conference support to meet those challenges.
A motion was passed to recognise Palestine as a state. It was quite overwhelming, rapturous applause for Jihad Dib, I'm told. Does that make things difficult for you?
Look, no. I mean, foreign policy is obviously a matter for the Commonwealth Government, but this was the State Labor Conference and you've asked. So I'd just say that the conference motion said that it was recognition of a Palestinian state as a priority, not immediately. And I just make the point that you can't recognise a Palestinian state while Hamas is in control of it. They're a terrorist organisation. Ultimately, the goal here, and it's been a bipartisan goal of federal governments for a long time, is for a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine side by side, and an end to the violence. How we get there is the big question, but the end result isn't in question.
Premier, I know there is nuance to that, and you pointing it out here on AM Agenda is one thing, but I think it's fair to say there are a fair number of members of your party that perhaps don't recognise that nuance so much and are more impatient than you seem to be this morning. Do you accept that?
I think that there's a variety of views. There's probably not a ubiquitous position about one of the most complex foreign policy issues in the world, and that would be reflected in the general public too. And Labor doesn't pretend to suggest that we've all got the same view on this. It's a very difficult question.
Okay.
Probably the only thing we would agree on is that whatever's passed at the New South Wales Labor Conference isn't going to make much of a difference. The federal government has to make these decisions, and peace is the ultimate goal for everybody. These things are laboriously negotiated out, and I don't think everyone was necessarily happy with the end result, but this is a matter for the federal Labor government.
Okay, but if it's a matter for the federal Labor government, this was a state conference at the weekend and this motion was passed. So are you saying it didn't have a place? It shouldn't have had a place at the state conference?
No, not at all. No, obviously our federal colleagues are responsible for foreign policy, and we've got a lot of members of the federal cabinet are New South Wales parliamentarians, and they come to conference. It's a pretty natural part of our 100-year-old party.
All right, let's talk about housing then. And since you become Premier, you have made housing a priority. You were focusing on renters at the weekend. And I want to ask you about those policies that you announced in terms of timeline, but also I want to ask you in the context of Anthony Albanese's reshuffle at the weekend. Do you think what he's done with putting Claire O'Neill essentially in charge of housing there has changed a little bit of emphasis for him? Have you noted a shift from the federal government about their priorities?
Well, look, I haven't necessarily noticed a shift other than it needs to be a priority for federal and state governments. Housing in particular is the biggest cost for everybody. It's one of the leading drivers of inflation in the economy. Yeah. It's a crisis, particularly in Sydney, which just a couple of weeks ago was noted as the second most expensive city in the world. So we want to work with anyone and everybody to get some kind of relief for renters, for those that have a mortgage, because we're living in a city that runs the risk of not having any grandchildren when we're losing twice as many young people as we're getting in.
So what's your view on, this great Australian dream of home ownership? Do you tell young people today that that is still achievable, or, do you back in what the Property Council and others want to see more of, and that is build to rent properties? Is that perhaps the new reality for this next generation?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. Ultimately, we, as a state government, are responsible for more supply, which is going to help both people that want to ultimately buy a property and those that are happy to or have to rent as an alternative. And we're not doing enough of that, and as a result it's putting major pressures on both the ability to buy a house and the ability to rent one. But I just make the point, when I was young, say 20 years ago, the question asked was, would I ever be able to afford to buy a place? Now young people ask whether they'll even be able to afford to rent one. And when you travel around Sydney on the weekends and you see 120 people waiting for an open house, and you've got young people like we had today at a media conference where one was a pilot and one worked at education, and they were getting kicked out of their rental properties as well, something's got to change here, or we're going to lose an entire generation, our best and brightest, to other states, other cities, other countries at New South Wales' expense.
Yeah, I mean, the housing crisis is just one example of huge cost of living pressures. We have new data today that shows that businesses, particularly hospitality and retail, are closing. They're folding at a rapid rate. This is just the latest data in a long line of pieces of data that point to, you know, big problems for small businesses in particular. It's getting harder and harder to make a living. New South Wales, of course, and particularly in Sydney, super expensive. Is this something that's on your radar? What can be done about it?
Yeah, massively. It's the biggest challenge, both the twin hits of both inflation and interest rates, smashing household budgets, something that we haven't seen in Australia for decades. One of the reasons we've made our changes to renters in New South Wales is, yes, of course, for young people, yes, of course, for the 2 million renters, but also for the economy. There's not a single business I have spoken to in the last year and a half that hasn't told me that it's almost impossible to get skilled labour, and the pressures on labour costs are massive. The major reason for that, Laura, is access to housing. If you offer a pay increase, but the vast majority of it is going to be eaten up because of a rent increase or a mortgage increase, then you're behind the 8 ball already, and that's why we've acted in the last day and certainly over the last 6 months to reform planning, to build more social housing, but also these much needed common sense changes to rents because, as I said earlier, a city without young people is a city without a future.
Okay, Premier Chris Minns, good to talk to you. We'll keep it short and sweet this morning. Just before I let you go, favourite gold medalist so far? Or any medal?
Yeah, I thought Jess Fox's win was incredible overnight. What an absolute champion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that. Thanks so much, Premier. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Laura.